March 14th, 1945. Rechlin-Lärz Airfield, Mecklenburg, Germany. The war was already lost, though no one dared say it aloud. On a frozen morning that smelled of snow and burnt oil, a Junkers Ju-87 Stuka sat motionless on the tarmac, its engine cowling open like the ribcage of something dead. Around it stood a dozen men in grease-stained Luftwaffe uniforms, their breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. They were not looking at the plane. They were looking at what was being poured into it. Coal dust. Fine, black, and impossibly strange. One of the ground crew, a young mechanic named Franz Kohler, stared at the dark powder streaming from a canvas sack into the modified fuel tanks and whispered to no one in particular, "We're feeding it ashes." No one corrected him, because in a way, he was right. Germany was dying from the inside. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich's synthetic fuel plants had been reduced to rubble by relentless Allied bombing. The Luna and Perlitz refineries, once the beating heart of the Luftwaffe's fuel supply, were little more than smoking craters. Pilots sat idle. Fighters rusted on runways. Entire squadrons were grounded not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. And so, in a basement laboratory beneath the Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium in Berlin, a team of desperate engineers had proposed the unthinkable. If they could no longer refine oil, they would burn coal. Not coal oil, not coal gas, coal itself, pulverized into dust so fine it could be suspended in air and ignited like gasoline vapor in a modified turbine engine. It sounded insane. It probably was. But in the dying days of the Reich, insanity had become policy. The test pilot assigned to the project was Hauptmann Dieter Kessler, a 32-year-old veteran with over 400 combat sorties and a Knight's Cross pinned to his collar. He had flown Stukas over Poland, France, and the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He had seen his friends spiral into the earth in flames. He had bombed columns of refugees and told himself it was war. But standing beside that coal-fed aircraft on that cold March morning, Kessler felt something he had not felt in years. Fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of flak or fighters, but something deeper, a dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind. This was not innovation. This was desperation made mechanical. And desperation, he knew, always carried a price. The ground crew finished their work in silence. The UMO-211 engine, originally designed to burn high-octane aviation fuel, had been retrofitted with experimental injectors and a secondary combustion chamber lined with heat-resistant ceramics. The coal dust was mixed with compressed air and fed into the chamber in controlled bursts, where it would ignite in a violent, continuous burn. In theory, it could produce enough thrust to keep the Stuka airborne. In theory. Kessler climbed into the cockpit, his gloved hands resting on the control column. The seat still smelled faintly of leather and sweat, familiar and comforting. But everything else felt wrong. The instrument panel had been modified with additional gauges monitoring combustion temperature, dust flow rate, and internal pressure. Red warning lights lined the edges like the eyes of something watching him. He flipped the ignition switch. The starter motor whined. The propeller blades turned slowly, then faster, and then, with a sound like tearing metal, the engine caught. It was not the smooth roar of a UMO-211. It was a grinding, guttural howl that shook the airframe and sent black smoke billowing from the exhaust stacks. The ground crew stepped back instinctively. Kessler's jaw tightened. The tachometer needle climbed. 1100 RPM, 1400, 1800. The engine was running. It was alive, but it sounded like it was screaming.
He throttled up slowly, feeling the plane strain against the wheel chocks. The entire aircraft vibrated with a low thrumming resonance that he could feel in his bones. On the edge of the runway, the chief engineer, Oberingenieur Wilhelm Strauss, watched through binoculars, his face expressionless. He had staked his career, perhaps his life, on this project. If it failed, there would be no second chance. If it succeeded, it might buy the Luftwaffe a few more weeks, a few more missions, a few more deaths. Either way, the war would end. But Strauss was not thinking about the war. He was thinking about the engine, about what they had created, and about what it might cost. Kessler released the brakes. The Stuka lurched forward, its tires crunching over frost-hardened concrete. He guided it onto the runway, aligning the nose with the distant tree line. His hand hovered over the throttle. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he pushed it forward. The engine bellowed. The plane accelerated. Faster, faster. The tail lifted, the wings bit into the cold air, and then, impossibly, the Stuka left the ground. It climbed slowly, grudgingly, trailing a thick plume of black smoke that painted a dark line across the pale sky. Kessler's heart pounded. He was flying. On coal dust, on ashes, on the last desperate gasp of a dying empire. He pulled back gently on the stick, gaining altitude, when suddenly the cockpit filled with the acrid stench of burning metal. The temperature gauge for the combustion chamber spiked into the red. A warning buzzer screamed in his ears, and then from somewhere deep in the engine came a sound he had never heard before. A sharp, metallic crack, like something breaking, like something giving way.
March 14th, 1945. 1,200 meters above Rechlin-Lärz Airfield. Kessler's hands moved on instinct. Throttle back, mixture lean, trim for glide. But the controls felt sluggish, disconnected, as if the plane itself were fighting him. The engine was still running, still howling, but the sound had changed. It was uneven now, pulsing in irregular bursts like a dying heartbeat. Smoke poured from the cowling, streaming past the canopy in thick, oily ribbons. He keyed the radio. Rechlin Tower, this is Test Unit 1. Engine malfunction. Request immediate clearance to land. Static crackled in his headset. Then the voice of the tower operator, young and uncertain. Test Unit 1, you are cleared for emergency approach. Runway 27 is open. Kessler banked the Stuka into a wide descending turn, his eyes locked on the airfield below. It looked impossibly small, impossibly far away. The engineers had warned him that the coal dust combustion system was unstable, that the temperatures inside the chamber could exceed operational limits if the fuel mixture wasn't perfectly balanced, that the ceramic lining might crack under thermal stress, that the whole thing might simply explode. But they had also told him it was the future, that if this worked, the Luftwaffe could fly again, that Germany could fight on. Kessler had believed them because he needed to believe them, because the alternative was surrender. And surrender, in the world he had been raised in, was worse than death. But now, as the engine coughed and the plane shuddered beneath him, he wondered if they had lied, not to him, to themselves. The altimeter unwound. 1,000 meters, 800, 600. The airfield stretched out ahead, a gray ribbon of concrete cutting through snow-covered fields. He could see the fire trucks racing into position, their red lights flashing. He could see the engineers and ground crew standing in a tight cluster, watching, waiting. He lined up with the runway, dropping the landing gear, feeling the heavy clunk as the wheels locked into place. The plane was sluggish, nose-heavy. He trimmed back, trying to keep it level. 400 meters, 300. The engine gave one final shuddering roar, and then it died. Completely. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream. Silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the whistle of wind over the wings and the hammering of his own pulse.
He was gliding now. Falling, really. A 10-ton piece of metal and coal dust and desperation, dropping toward the earth. Kessler's training took over. He pushed the nose down slightly, trading altitude for airspeed, keeping the wings level. The runway rushed up to meet him. Too fast, too steep. He pulled back on the stick, flaring at the last possible second. The wheels kissed the concrete with a violent jolt. The plane bounced, slammed down again, and he stood on the brakes. Rubber screamed. The tail swung left. He corrected with the rudder, fighting to keep it straight. The Stuka skidded, fish-tailed, and finally rolled to a stop 200 meters from the end of the runway. For a long moment, Kessler sat frozen in the cockpit, his hands still gripping the controls. He was alive. He had landed. But the smell of burning metal was overwhelming now, seeping into the cockpit, choking him. He popped the canopy and climbed out, his legs shaking, his lungs gasping for clean air. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft. Oberengineer Strauss arrived moments later, his face pale but composed. He walked slowly around the Stuka, inspecting the engine cowling, the exhaust stacks, the blackened streaks along the fuselage. Kessler climbed down and stood beside him, still catching his breath. "What happened up there?" Strauss asked quietly. Kessler shook his head. "The combustion chamber. Something cracked. The temperature spiked and the engine lost power." Strauss nodded slowly, as if he had expected this. "Did it run?" "Yes, for 8 minutes. Then it worked." Kessler stared at him. "It almost killed me." Strauss met his gaze, and for the first time, Kessler saw something in the older man's eyes. Not regret, not guilt, something colder. Calculation. "Everything almost kills us now, Hauptmann. The question is whether it kills us before we can use it." They opened the engine cowling an hour later. What they found inside made even the most experienced mechanics step back. The ceramic lining of the combustion chamber had fractured in a dozen places, spiderwebbed with cracks that glowed faintly with residual heat. The fuel injectors were clogged with carbonized coal dust, fused into black, glassy lumps. The turbine blades were pitted and scorched, their edges worn down as if they had been sandblasted. But the engine had run. It had generated thrust. It had kept a fully loaded Stuka airborne for 8 minutes. And 8 minutes, Strauss knew, could be enough. Enough to reach a target. Enough to drop a bomb. Enough to die for the fatherland. He ordered the chamber rebuilt, reinforced, the injectors cleaned and recalibrated. And he ordered a second test flight, this time with full combat load. Kessler learned of the decision that evening, sitting alone in the officers' mess with a glass of schnapps he couldn't taste. Strauss had not asked for his consent. He had simply informed him. "You will fly again tomorrow. Same aircraft, same engine, but this time you will carry ordnance, 600 kilograms, and you will fly to an altitude of 3,000 meters." Kessler asked why. Strauss had not answered. But later, when Kessler returned to his quarters, he found a folder on his bunk, unmarked, unsealed. Inside were reconnaissance photographs of a Soviet supply column moving west through Poland. Trucks, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers. A target, a real target. And beneath the photographs, a handwritten note in Strauss's precise angular script. "If we are to die, let us die proving it was possible." Kessler stared at the note for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, placed it back in the folder, and lay down on his bunk. Outside, the wind howled across the airfield, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and snow. He closed his eyes, but he did not sleep, because he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that tomorrow's flight would be different. Tomorrow, the coal dust engine would not just be a test. It would be a weapon, and he would be the one to wield it. or be consumed by it.
March 15, 1945. Rechlin-Lärz Airfield. 05:47 hours. The sun had not yet risen when Kessler walked across the tarmac toward the Stuka. The air was colder than the day before, sharp enough to burn his lungs with each breath. The plane sat waiting, its engine cowling closed, its wings heavy with 6 50-kilogram bombs slung beneath them. The ground crew had worked through the night, rebuilding the combustion chamber with thicker ceramic plating, recalibrating the fuel injectors, reinforcing the turbine housing. They had done everything they could. But Kessler could see the doubt in their eyes. They did not expect him to come back. He was not sure he expected it either. Ober-Engineer Strauss stood beside the aircraft, clipboard in hand, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn darkness. "The engine is stable," he said without preamble. "We have reduced the combustion temperature by 15% and increased the airflow to prevent carbon buildup. You should have sustained thrust for at least 20 minutes. Kessler nodded. 20 minutes. Enough time to reach the target. Enough time to drop the bombs. Enough time to turn back. Maybe. Strauss hesitated, then added quietly, "If the engine fails again, do not attempt to restart it. Glide to the nearest open ground and bail out. The airframe cannot sustain a second thermal event." Kessler looked at him. "You're telling me this plane might explode?" "I'm telling you it's a prototype, and prototypes are unpredictable." Strauss paused. "But so is war." Kessler climbed into the cockpit. The seat was cold, the instruments dark. He strapped himself in, rammed through the pre-flight checklist, and flipped the ignition switch. The starter motor whined, the propeller turned, and once again the engine roared to life with that same grinding, guttural howl. But this time, it felt different, steadier, angrier. He throttled up slowly, watching the gauges. Combustion temperature, normal. Dust flow rate, stable. Internal pressure, within limits. He released the brakes and rolled toward the runway. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a thin band of pale gray creeping over the horizon. Kessler aligned the Stuka with the center line, took a breath, and pushed the throttle forward. The plane surged ahead, heavy with ordnance, clawing for speed. The tail lifted, the wheels left the ground, and he was airborne. The climb was slow, laborious. The coal dust engine lacked the smooth, responsive power of conventional fuel. It felt brutish, reluctant, as if it resented being forced to work. But it worked. Kessler leveled off at 3,000 meters, the altimeter steady, the horizon a flat line of frozen earth and skeletal forests. Below him, Germany stretched out in shades of gray and white, scarred by craters and burn marks, empty of life. He flew northeast, toward the Polish border, following the route marked on his knee map. 40 kilometers, 30 minutes, if the engine held, if the winds didn't shift, if the war gave him one last mission, one last chance to matter. He found the column 26 minutes into the flight. A long, dark line of vehicles crawling west along a snow-covered road, their engines trailing exhaust plumes that hung in the cold air like smoke signals. Soviet trucks, fuel tankers, ammunition carriers, everything the Red Army needed to keep pushing toward Berlin. Kessler circled once, gauging the wind, the distance, the angle of attack. Then he rolled the Stuka into a dive. The engine screamed, the airframe shuddered, the altimeter unwound in a blur, 2,500 meters, 2,000, 1,500. The trucks grew larger, their shapes sharpening into focus. He could see soldiers scattering, diving into ditches, pointing skyward. Anti-aircraft fire erupted in jagged bursts of black smoke. Tracers arced toward him, bright and lazy, then suddenly fast. He ignored them, focused on the sight, on the target, on the moment. At 800 meters, he released the bombs, all 6 of them. He felt the plane lurch upward as the weight dropped away, and he pulled back hard on the stick, hauling the Stuka out of the dive. The G-forces crushed him into the seat. His vision tunneled, his lungs burned. And then, behind him,
The bombs hit. 6 sharp, overlapping explosions that rippled through the column, tearing trucks apart, igniting fuel tankers in roaring fireballs, scattering debris and bodies across the snow. Kessler leveled off, glancing back over his shoulder. The road was burning. Black smoke billowed skyward. He had hit them. He had done his job. And for a brief, hollow moment, he felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, just exhaustion. Then the engine coughed. Once. Twice. The tachometer needle dropped. The combustion chamber temperature spiked. Kessler's stomach lurched. Not again, not now. He throttled back, tried to stabilize the mixture, but the engine was dying. The howl became a wheeze. The wheeze became a rattle. And then silence. The propeller stopped. The cockpit filled with the smell of burnt coal and overheated metal. He was gliding again, but this time there was no airfield below, no runway, just frozen fields and enemy territory. Kessler keyed the radio. "Rechlin Tower, this is Test Unit 1. Engine failure. Going down." Static. Then Strauss's voice, faint and distant. "Copy, Test Unit 1. Good luck." The line went dead. Kessler scanned the ground, searching for anything flat, anything clear. There, a field, snow-covered, empty. He banked toward it, trimming for the glide, praying the landing gear would hold. The ground rushed up. He flared. The wheels hit. The plane bounced, skidded, and slammed nose first into a snowbank. The impact threw him forward against the straps. Glass shattered. Metal groaned. And then stillness. Kessler sat in the wrecked cockpit, breathing hard, his head ringing. He was alive. Barely. He popped the canopy and climbed out, stumbling into the snow. Behind him, the Stuka sat crumpled and broken, its coal dust engine silent forever. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of Soviet trucks. They would find him soon. He looked back at the plane one last time. It had flown. Against all reason, against all sanity, it had flown. But it had not saved anything. Not the war, not Germany, not him. Kessler turned and began walking west, toward the setting sun, toward whatever remained of the world he had known. Behind him, the smoke from the burning column rose into the sky, black and thick, blotting out the light. And somewhere in Berlin, in a basement office beneath the ruins of the Reich liftout ministerium, Oberingenieur Wilhelm Strauss closed the file marked Kohlenstab-Antrieb and placed it in a drawer. The coal dust engine had worked. For 26 minutes it had worked. But the war was over, and the future, whatever it held, would not be built on ashes.